The rugged mountains of Montana cast long shadows over the mining town of Silverbrook, a place where men dug silver from the earth and expectations ran as deep as the ore veins. In this remote outpost of 1885, a woman's worth was measured by her ability to provide comfort without complaint, to bend without breaking under the harsh realities of frontier life. It was no place for someone like Abigail Montgomery, whose spine seemed forged from the same unyielding steel as the railroad tracks that had brought her west. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in Silverbrook's dusty main street, the horses' labored breathing forming small clouds in the crisp autumn air. Abigail. Montgomery gripped her valise with gloved hands, waiting for the other passengers to descend before making her own careful exit. Her traveling suit of deep burgundy, though simple in design, was immaculately tailored to her tall frame, the high collar and sensible cut speaking of practicality rather than fashion. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver announced, offering a weathered hand to assist her down. Abigail accepted with a nod, her keen grey eyes immediately taking in the details of her new surroundings. Silverbrook was smaller than she'd imagined from the newspaper advertisements. A single main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, the silver mine looming on the hillside like a sentinel watching over its domain. Men in work clothes moved purposefully between the assayer's office and the saloon. Women in practical dresses hurried along wooden sidewalks with baskets of supplies. Children darted between wagons, their laughter a counterpoint to the constant clang of metal from the blacksmith's shop. The town hummed with industry and purpose. "Must be her," a woman's voice carried from the general store porch. "Thomas Parker's mail-order bride. Poor man doesn't know what he's in for," another replied with undisguised amusement. "Look at how she stands, straight as a schoolmarm's ruler. Bet she's got opinions about everything." "Third time's not the charm, I reckon. First two took one look at her letters and sent her straight back east." Abigail's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she gave no other indication that she'd heard. She was accustomed to such talk. In Pittsburgh, her father's friends had called her headstrong and difficult, qualities that had become increasingly problematic as she approached 30 without accepting any of the marriage proposals deemed suitable by her family. The ad in the matrimonial news had offered an escape. Silver miner seeks bride. Age 35, established claim. Requires sensible woman for correspondence and potential marriage. Passage paid upon agreement. Thomas Parker's letters had been straightforward and honest. His handwriting was neat, his grammar correct, his expectations reasonable. Or so they had seemed. Abigail had responded with equal candor, detailing her education, her experience managing her father's household after her mother's death, and her practical skills with accounting and correspondence. What she hadn't mentioned was her tendency to speak her mind regardless of consequence, her unshakable belief in women's suffrage, or her habit of questioning authority when it seemed arbitrary or unjust. Those qualities had already cost her 2 potential matches in Montana territory through previous advertisements. "Miss Montgomery?" Abigail turned toward the voice, finding herself face to face with a man in his late 30s, his clothes clean, but worn at the edges. Thomas Parker was of medium height, with broad shoulders and a beard neatly trimmed beneath watchful blue eyes. His face was weathered by outdoor work, but his expression seemed open, if cautious. "Mr. Parker," Abigail confirmed, extending her hand formally. He took it with a brief, firm shake. "Welcome to Silverbrook." "Thank you." She met his gaze directly, neither lowering her eyes demurely as convention might dictate, nor challenging him outright. Thomas studied her face with unmistakable assessment. "You're taller than I expected." "Yes," Abigail replied simply. "I mentioned my height in my third letter." "So you did." His brow furrowed slightly. "Your letters were precise. I believe in clarity of communication, Mr. Parker." "Thomas," he corrected, then glanced at her single trunk being unloaded from the stagecoach. "Is that all your belongings?" "I travel light," Abigail said. "Practicality dictates bringing only what's necessary." Something flickered across Thomas's face. Surprise, perhaps, or recalculation. "My wagon's this way," he said, gesturing to a serviceable buckboard tied near the general store. "We should reach my claim before sunset." As they walked, Abigail felt curious eyes following their progress. Silverbrook was small enough that a newcomer would naturally attract attention, but she sensed something more in their gazes. Speculation, mingled with skepticism. "Your journey was comfortable?" Thomas asked as he lifted her trunk into the wagon with practiced ease. "Comfortable would be an overstatement," Abigail replied honestly. "But it was uneventful, which is preferable." Thomas's mouth twitched, though whether in amusement or irritation was difficult to determine. He helped her onto the wagon seat with proper courtesy, then circled to take his place beside her. "I should tell you," he said as he took up the reins. "My circumstances have changed somewhat since our correspondence began." Abigail's spine stiffened further. "In what way, Mr. Parker?" "My claim is producing well," he began, guiding the horses down the main street toward a dirt road leading into the foothills. "Better than expected, in fact." "That sounds like a positive development." "It is." He paused, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But other aspects of my situation have become more complicated." Before Abigail could press for clarification, a woman stepped directly into their path, forcing Thomas to pull the horses to an abrupt halt. She was perhaps 40, dressed in a practical but well-made dress, her manner suggesting both authority and concern. "Thomas Parker, you stop right there," she commanded, approaching the wagon. "Is this her?" "Mrs. Coleman," Thomas acknowledged with resignation. "Yes, this is Miss Abigail Montgomery. Miss Montgomery, this is Judith Coleman, our town's schoolteacher." "A pleasure," Abigail offered, though the other woman's scrutiny was far from welcoming. "Miss Montgomery," Mrs. Coleman said, her voice lowering, "I feel obligated to inform you that Mr. Parker has not been forthcoming about his full circumstances." Thomas's grip tightened on the reins. "Judith, this isn't the time." "When would be the time, Thomas? After she's committed herself." The schoolteacher turned back to Abigail. "Mr. Parker is a widower with 5 daughters, the youngest barely 4. His advertisement conveniently omitted this fact." Abigail felt the impact of this revelation like a physical blow, though her expression remained composed. 5 children. No mention of children had appeared in any of Thomas's letters. "I see," she said, her voice measured as she turned to Thomas. "That is indeed a significant omission, Mr. Parker." Thomas's jaw set in a hard line. "I intended to explain everything properly once we reached the homestead." "Did you?" Mrs. Coleman interjected. "Or were you hoping she'd feel too stranded to refuse once she saw the reality?" She addressed Abigail again. "The stagecoach returns eastward tomorrow morning. I would be happy to arrange accommodations for you at the boarding house tonight." Abigail looked between them, noting the tension in Thomas's shoulders and the protective concern in Mrs. Coleman's stance. Underneath their exchange lay something deeper, some history or conflict that predated her arrival. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Coleman," Abigail said carefully, "but I believe Mr. Parker owes me a full explanation before I make any decisions." The schoolteacher seemed surprised by this response. "Of course, I simply wanted you to know your options." "And now I do," Abigail replied with a polite nod that nonetheless signaled the end of the conversation. As Mrs. Coleman stepped back, Thomas licked the reins to set the horses in motion once more. They traveled in tense silence until the town disappeared behind them, the road narrowing as it wound through stands of ponderosa pine. "My wife died 2 years ago," Thomas finally said, his voice tight. "Influenza. It took her in 3 days." Abigail waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "Sarah was well loved in Silverbrook. She taught alongside Mrs. Coleman before we married." His hands adjusted on the reins. "After she died, I focused on the mine, on providing stability. The girls have been managing." "5 daughters," Abigail said, the unasked question evident in her tone. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Elizabeth is 15, Catherine 12, Mary 9, Rose 7, and little Grace just turned 4. He paused. "I should have told you. But the first 2 respondents to my advertisements withdrew their interest immediately upon learning about the children." "So you decided deception was the better approach?" Abigail asked, unable to keep a note of sharpness from her voice. "I decided I needed help," Thomas countered, finally turning to meet her gaze. "The girls need a woman's guidance. I need a partner who understands that life here requires practicality and strength. Your letters suggested you possessed both qualities, and yet you didn't trust me with the full truth. Would you have come if you'd known?" The question hung between them as the wagon crested a hill, revealing a valley where a sturdy 2-story cabin stood near a creek. Smoke curled from the stone. Chimney and a barn and several outbuildings created a tidy compound. Beyond them, the entrance to a mine shaft was visible, reinforced with heavy timbers. "It's a fair question," Abigail acknowledged. "But now we'll never know, will we, Mr. Parker? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." As the wagon approached the homestead, Abigail noticed movement at the cabin's windows, small faces appearing and disappearing like cautious woodland creatures assessing a newcomer. Thomas slowed the horses to a gentle stop in the yard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the well-swept ground. "The girls have been anticipating your arrival," he said, his tone softening slightly. "They've been preparing for days." Before Abigail could respond, the cabin door burst open and 4 girls tumbled out in a flurry of aprons and braided hair, the oldest hanging back with marked reserve. They arranged themselves by height beside the porch steps, their expressions ranging from open curiosity to thinly veiled suspicion. Thomas helped Abigail down from the wagon, then turned to make introductions. "Girls, this is Miss Montgomery. Miss Montgomery, these are my daughters." The oldest stepped forward, her posture mirroring Abigail's own straight-backed stance. "I'm Elizabeth Parker," she said with practiced formality, though her blue eyes, so like her father's, held a challenge. "I've been managing the household since Mother died." "How do you do, Elizabeth?" Abigail replied, meeting the girl's gaze directly. "That's a significant responsibility for someone your age." Elizabeth's chin lifted slightly. Someone had to do it. The second eldest girl stepped forward, her brown hair neatly braided and tied with faded blue ribbons. "I'm Catherine," she said with a small curtsy that seemed both sincere and studied. "I help with the cooking and mending." "I'm Mary," announced the third, unable to contain her energy as she bounced on her toes. "I'm 9, and I can already read chapter books and do sums up to 20. "Very impressive," Abigail acknowledged with a nod that made the girl beam. The second youngest hid partially behind Catherine, peering around her sister's skirts with wide eyes. "That's Rose," Thomas explained. "She's shy with strangers." Abigail noticed the littlest one was missing. "And Grace," a shadow crossed Thomas's face. "She's inside. She hasn't been speaking since her mother passed. Mrs. Coleman says it's not uncommon with trauma, but—" He trailed off, the unfinished sentence conveying his helplessness. in the face of his youngest daughter's silent grief. "I see," Abigail said quietly. Something in her tone must have conveyed genuine understanding, for Elizabeth's defensive posture relaxed incrementally. "I've prepared dinner," the oldest girl announced. "Nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits." "That sounds perfect after a long journey," Abigail replied. "Perhaps I could freshen up first." Thomas nodded, lifting her trunk from the wagon. "Elizabeth, show Miss Montgomery to the guest room while I tend to the horses." The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious and meticulously maintained. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Handmade curtains framed the windows, and braided rag rugs softened the wooden floors. Everything spoke of care and effort, if not abundance. Elizabeth led Abigail to a small but clean bedroom off the main living area. "This was Mother's sewing room," she explained, her voice carefully neutral. "Father cleared it out for you." A narrow bed with a colorful quilt stood beneath the window. A washstand with pitcher and basin occupied one corner, and a chest of drawers with a small mirror hung above it completed the sparse furnishings. "Thank you, Elizabeth," Abigail said. "You've done an admirable job maintaining your home." The girl hesitated at the doorway. "It's only temporary, you know." "What is? Your stay here?" Elizabeth's words came in a controlled rush. "The others before you didn't last a week. One took one look at us and left on the next stage. The other tried for 3 days before she declared us impossible and fled back to civilization." Abigail regarded the girl steadily. "I'm not easily frightened, Elizabeth. It's not about being frightened," the girl countered. "It's about understanding what you're getting into. Father needs help with the mine accounts and correspondence. We need someone who understands that life here isn't like back east. The women who came before, they wanted to change everything, to make us into something we're not. And what are you exactly?" Elizabeth's chin lifted proudly. "Survivors. Father works from dawn till dusk. I manage the house. Catherine keeps everyone fed and clothed. Mary teaches Rose her letters. We make do, and little Grace?" Abigail asked gently. Something flickered in Elizabeth's composed expression, a crack in her carefully constructed maturity. "Grace needs more than we can give her, but we're managing." "Managing isn't the same as thriving," Abigail observed. "We don't have the luxury of thinking beyond tomorrow, Miss Montgomery." With that parting statement, Elizabeth left, closing the door firmly behind her. Alone, Abigail moved to the small window. The view encompassed the sloping yard, the distant mine entrance, and the mountains beyond. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, a stark beauty that spoke of both promise and hardship. This was not what she had expected when she answered Thomas Parker's advertisement. She had prepared herself for the challenges of frontier life, for the adjustment to marriage with a stranger, for the demands of helping to run a mining operation. But 5 children, one traumatized into silence, all still grieving their mother, led by a 15-year-old determined to protect them from further change or disappointment. Thomas had been dishonest by omission, a realization that set her teeth on edge. Yet the desperation behind that choice was becoming clearer. These children needed help, whether they recognized it or not. Elizabeth was carrying a burden no child should bear, playing mother when she should still be growing into her own womanhood. Abigail poured water from the pitcher into the basin and washed away the dust of travel, her mind working through her options. The stagecoach would indeed return eastward tomorrow. She could leave, justified in her indignation over Thomas's deception. She had enough money saved for the return journey, and her father, though disappointed, would likely welcome her back. Or she could stay, at least long enough to properly assess the situation. Thomas Parker had been wrong to withhold such critical information, but his need was genuine. These girls deserve better than a parade of would-be stepmothers abandoning them after glimpsing the magnitude of the challenge. The dinner bell interrupted her deliberations. Abigail straightened her collar, smoothed her hair, and took a steadying breath. Whatever decision she made, it would not be based on retreat from difficulty. That had never been her way. In the main room, the family had assembled around a solid wooden table. The stew bubbled in a cast-iron pot suspended over the fire, and a plate of golden biscuits sat at the center of the table. Catherine was ladling portions into mismatched bowls, while Rose solemnly distributed spoons. Mary chattered excitedly, pausing only when her father cleared his throat meaningfully. In a rocking chair near the fire sat the smallest Parker, Grace, with Thomas's blue eyes and delicate features that must have come from her mother. The child watched Abigail with an unnerving intensity, neither fearful nor welcoming, simply observing with the complete focus only the very young can maintain. "Please join us, Miss Montgomery," Thomas said formally, indicating a place at the table between Mary and Catherine. The meal began in awkward silence, broken only by Mary's irrepressible commentary on everything from the weather to the new calf born to their milk cow the previous week. Gradually, Catherine joined in, explaining how she had modified her mother's biscuit recipe when certain ingredients became scarce. Throughout the meal, Abigail noticed how Elizabeth watched over her siblings with vigilant care. Cutting Rose's meat into smaller pieces without being asked, quietly reminding Mary to use her napkin, ensuring everyone's cup remained filled. The girl performed these tasks automatically, her own meal growing cold as she tended to others' needs. Thomas, too, seemed to be observing Abigail's reactions, gauging her response to the chaotic family dinner. When Grace refused to eat, slipping from her chair to return to the rocking chair, he made no comment, though a muscle in his jaw tightened perceptibly. "The stew is excellent, Catherine," Abigail said as she accepted a second helping. "Did you use rosemary?" The girl brightened visibly. "Yes, ma'am. It grows wild near the creek. Mother showed me where to find it." Catherine knows all the useful implants, Mary announced proudly. She even made a poultice when Rose cut her hand on Pa's saw. "Is that so?" Abigail turned to Catherine with genuine interest. "I've always found botany fascinating. Perhaps you could show me your gathering spots." "Sometime." Before Catherine could respond, Elizabeth interjected, "Miss Montgomery may not be staying long enough for that." A tense silence fell over the table. Thomas set down his spoon with deliberate care. "Elizabeth—" "It's a fair observation," Abigail interrupted calmly. "Given Mr. Parker's significant omission regarding your presence, it would be perfectly reasonable for me to depart tomorrow." 5 pairs of eyes fixed on her, 4 around the table and 1 from the rocking chair by the fire. However, Abigail continued, meeting each gaze in turn, "I did not travel all this way to retreat at the first sign of difficulty. I propose a compromise. I'll remain in Silverbrook for 2 weeks, Abigail proposed, her hands folded calmly on the table. During that time, I'll assist with household matters and begin organizing the mine's accounts. At the end of that period, both Mr. Parker and I can decide if a more permanent arrangement would be beneficial." Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to cautious relief. "That seems reasonable. However," Abigail continued, her voice firm, "I have conditions. First, complete honesty from this point forward. No more omissions, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might be." Thomas nodded, though his jaw tensed at her directness. "Second, I'll need access to all financial records for the mine and household. If I'm to help establish proper accounting, I must understand the complete picture. The mine accounts are private business," Thomas began, "which you specifically mentioned needing assistance with in your advertisement," Abigail countered. "I spent 3 years managing my father's manufacturing business accounts. I assure you I'm both qualified and discreet." Mary watched this exchange, with fascination, her head swiveling between the adults like a spectator at a tennis match. Even Catherine seemed impressed by Abigail's composure. Elizabeth's expression remained guarded. "And your third condition, Miss Montgomery," Abigail turned to the oldest girl, "that we all recognize this arrangement is temporary until proven otherwise. I won't make promises I can't keep, nor will I pretend to replace your mother. But while I'm here, I expect to be treated with basic courtesy, just as I will extend the same to each of you." A charged silence followed this declaration. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "Your terms are acceptable, Miss Montgomery. 2 weeks, beginning tomorrow." "Beginning now," Abigail corrected. "The stagecoach leaves at dawn, and I intend to unpack this evening." Thomas's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "As you wish." After dinner, the family settled into evening routines that spoke of long-established habit. Catherine and Mary cleared the table, while Rose swept the floor with methodical care. Elizabeth disappeared upstairs, returning with a basket of mending that she positioned near the brightest lamp. Thomas pulled on his coat. "I need to check the mine supports before turning in. The spring melt caused some shifting in the lower tunnel." "At night?" Abigail questioned. "The silver doesn't know if it's day or night, Miss Montgomery," he replied, his tone not unkind but matter-of-fact. "And problems don't wait for convenient times to be addressed." After he departed, Abigail observed the girls' activities, noting how efficiently they worked, despite their youth. Even little Rose had clear responsibilities, folding clean dishcloths, with careful precision and arranging them in a neat stack. Only Grace remained apart, still in her rocking chair, a small wooden horse clutched in her tiny hands. The child rocked it back and forth, her expression distant. Abigail approached slowly, kneeling to bring herself to the child's eye level. "Hello, Grace. That's a beautiful horse." The little girl didn't respond, though her rocking motion paused momentarily. "My father carved animals for me when I was a girl," Abigail continued, keeping her voice gentle. "I had a whole farm of wooden creatures. My favorite was a fox with a very fluffy tail made from rabbit fur." Grace's eyes flickered toward her, then back to the wooden horse. "Did your father make this for you?" A tiny nod, so subtle it was almost imperceptible, but present nonetheless. "He must love you very much." Abigail didn't reach for the child or the toy, simply remaining at her level, allowing Grace to observe her without pressure. From across the room, Elizabeth watched this interaction with unreadable eyes over the shirt she was mending. When Grace unexpectedly extended the wooden horse toward Abigail for inspection, the older girl's needle paused mid-stitch. Abigail accepted the offering with appropriate gravity. "He's very handsome. Does he have a name?" Grace shook her head. "The best horses always need good names," Abigail suggested, returning the toy carefully. "Perhaps you'll think of one." The interaction was brief, but as Abigail rose to continue her exploration of the cabin, she noticed Elizabeth's assessing gaze following her movements. The girl's expression remained guarded, but something had shifted. A fractional softening, perhaps, or at least a willingness to reserve judgment. As the evening progressed, Abigail took mental inventory of the household. The cabin was solidly built and clean, but showed signs of a family focused on survival rather than comfort. Curtains needed mending, chair legs wobbled from loose joints, and the girls' dresses, while clean, bore multiple patches and hems that had been let down repeatedly. However, there were unexpected touches of beauty as well. A collection of pine cones and interesting stones arranged on the mantel, sprigs of dried wildflowers tucked into a cracked vase, hand-drawn pictures tacked to the wall beside the fireplace. Even in hardship, someone, likely Elizabeth, had tried to maintain elements of a proper home. When the time came for the younger girls to prepare for bed, Abigail observed their nightly rituals. Elizabeth supervised with the efficiency of long practice, checking faces and hands for proper washing, hearing prayers, and overseeing the hanging of clothes. "Would you like me to read a bedtime story?" Abigail offered as the three younger girls climbed into the large bed they shared in the loft. Mary bounced excitedly. "Yes, please. Elizabeth used to read to us, but she's been too busy since—" She stopped abruptly, glancing at Grace. "Since I've had more responsibilities," Elizabeth finished smoothly. "But if you'd like to, Miss Montgomery, Mary can show you where the books are kept." The girl led Abigail to a small shelf containing a modest collection of well-worn volumes. Abigail selected The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, noting the dog-eared pages and cracked spine that spoke of frequent readings. As she settled into a chair between the two beds, Catherine and Elizabeth sharing one, the three younger girls in the other, Abigail opened to the first chapter. Her voice, usually so measured in adult company, transformed as she read, taking on different inflections for each character, her face animated in a way it hadn't been during the earlier conversations. Mary and Rose were rapt, their eyes wide with delight at her theatrical reading. Even Catherine smiled, despite her attempts to appear mature. Elizabeth pretended to focus on planning the next day's meals in a small notebook, but Abigail noticed how she tilted her head to listen. Most surprising was Grace. The little girl inched closer as the story progressed, eventually settling at the foot of the bed, her wooden horse clutched to her chest, her blue eyes fixed on Abigail's face as the adventures of Tom and Huck unfolded. When Thomas returned an hour later, covered in rock dust and weariness, he paused in the doorway of the loft, clearly startled by the tableau before him. His daughters grouped around Abigail, listening with uncharacteristic harmony, even little Grace engaged where she had been withdrawn for so long. Abigail concluded the chapter and closed the book. "That's enough adventure for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll discover what happens to Tom in the graveyard." Protests arose from Mary and Rose, but Elizabeth surprised everyone by supporting Abigail. "Miss Montgomery is right. It's well past bedtime, and tomorrow is a school day." As the girls settled under their quilts, Thomas retreated downstairs, his expression thoughtful. When Abigail descended after saying goodnight to each child, she found him at the kitchen table, a ledger open before him, his pen moving in laborious calculations. "Your daughters are delightful," Abigail said, taking a seat across from him. "They've clearly been raised with care." Thomas looked up, surprise flickering across his features. "That's not what the previous candidate said. Mrs. Winters called them wild as mountain goats before she left. Miss Hargrove managed 3 days before declaring them beyond civilizing." "Perhaps Mrs. Winters and Miss Hargrove were expecting docility rather than character," Abigail suggested. "Your daughters have adapted to difficult circumstances with remarkable resilience." "They have," Thomas agreed, pride momentarily displacing his perpetual worry. "Though Elizabeth has taken on far too much, she's become old before her time." "She's protecting them," Abigail observed. "And you?" His weathered hands stilled over the ledger. "Me?" "She believes maintaining her mother's household exactly as it was somehow preserves something essential. That changing anything might mean losing more than they already have." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Sarah was the heart of this place," he finally said, his voice low. "When she died, it was like all the warmth went out of the house. I could manage the physical needs, food, shelter, clothing, but the rest," he gestured vaguely, "the girls need more than I know how to give them. Which is why you placed the advertisement." "Yes," he met her gaze directly. "I should have been honest about the children from the start. I thought, if the right person just met them first, saw them as individuals rather than burdens." 5. "Children are not a minor detail to omit, Mr. Parker." "Thomas," he corrected again. "And no, they aren't. But after 2 immediate rejections, I became desperate. Winter is coming. The mine needs my attention if we're to have enough stored to last through the snow months. The girls need proper supervision. He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging more rock dust. I thought surely, once the right woman met them... You were gambling that maternal instinct would overcome rational consideration, Abigail concluded. A faint flush colored his cheeks above his beard. When you put it that way, it sounds manipulative. It was, Abigail stated plainly, and yet here I am agreeing to a 2-week trial. Why? The question seemed to surprise him as much as her. After the deception, after seeing the reality of the situation, why stay even temporarily? Abigail considered this carefully. Because problems don't wait for convenient times to be addressed, she said, echoing his earlier words. And because your daughters deserve better than a string of disappointed candidates passing through their lives like tumbleweeds. Dawn arrived, in Silverbrook, with golden light spilling through the cabin windows. Abigail woke early, already accustomed to rising with the sun from years managing her father's household. She dressed quickly in a practical brown skirt and white shirtwaist, pinning her hair in a simple but neat arrangement. The small mirror above her washstand reflected determination in her grey eyes. She had 2 weeks to assess whether this situation could work, and she intended to make every day count. In the main room, she found Elizabeth already stoking the fire, her movements efficient but weary, suggesting she'd been awake for some time. "Good morning," Abigail greeted her. "You're an early riser." "Someone needs to have breakfast ready before Pa leaves for the mine," Elizabeth replied, measuring coffee grounds into the percolator. "He's already gone to check the supports." "What can I do to help?" Elizabeth paused, clearly unaccustomed to such offers from adults. "The biscuits need kneading," she finally said, gesturing toward a bowl of dough covered with a cloth. Abigail rolled up her sleeves and set to work, noting that Elizabeth had already mixed the ingredients. "You make bread every morning?" "3 times a week. We have biscuits on other days. They're quicker." As they worked side by side, Abigail observed how the girl managed the kitchen with practiced skill far beyond her 15 years. Elizabeth knew exactly how many pieces of kindling would bring the oven to proper temperature, how long to steep the coffee for her father's preference, and which jam jar was running low. "The huckleberry's almost gone," Elizabeth commented, setting the table with practiced movements. "Catherine and I need to gather more before the first frost." "Perhaps I could join you," Abigail suggested, cutting the dough into neat circles. "I'm quite good at foraging." Elizabeth shot her a skeptical glance, but didn't refuse outright. Progress, Abigail thought. The other girls descended from the loft in various states of wakefulness. Catherine immediately moved to help with breakfast preparations, while Mary herded a sleepy Rose toward the wash basin. Only Grace remained upstairs, apparently still asleep. "Grace has nightmares," Mary explained when she caught Abigail glancing toward the loft. "Elizabeth says she needs extra sleep when the dreams come." Thomas returned as breakfast was being served, his clothes bearing fresh rock dust and his expression preoccupied. "The North Tunnel needs additional supports," he announced, accepting the cup of coffee Elizabeth poured him. "Jenkins is bringing timber this afternoon." "Is the mine unsafe?" Abigail asked directness. Thomas met her gaze over his coffee cup. "All mines have risks, Miss Montgomery. The key is identifying problems before they become dangers." "The last collapse killed 3 men," Elizabeth said quietly. "Pa pulled them out himself." Thomas's expression tightened. "That was a different section, a different time. We've taken precautions." He turned to the 3 younger girls. "Hurry with your breakfast. Mrs. Coleman doesn't appreciate tardiness. We have 20 minutes before school," Mary protested. "That's enough time for 3 more biscuits." Despite the gravity of the mine discussion, Abigail found herself smiling at the girls' enthusiasm for food. Mary had the gangly build of a child in growth, all knees and elbows, and endless appetite. As the girls prepared for school, collecting books and lunch pails, Abigail noticed Grace appearing at the foot of the stairs, her blonde hair tangled from sleep, the wooden horse still clutched in one hand. The child watched the morning bustle with solemn eyes, making no move to join the activity. "Good morning, Grace," Abigail said. "Would you like some breakfast?" The little girl didn't respond, though her gaze followed Abigail as she moved through the kitchen. Without prompting, Elizabeth placed a small plate with a cut-up biscuit and honey at the table's end. "She'll eat when she's ready," the older girl explained. "Sometimes it takes a while." Thomas finished his breakfast quickly, pushing back from the table with purpose. "I need to meet Jenkins about those supports. Girls, mind Mrs. Coleman, Miss Montgomery." He hesitated, clearly uncertain about her role. "Perhaps Miss Montgomery could accompany us to town," Catherine suggested. "She could meet Mrs. Coleman and see the school. And the mercantile," Mary added excitedly. "Mr. Wilson got new fabric in last week and ribbons from Denver." Thomas considered this. "If Miss Montgomery wishes to see the town properly, that would be agreeable." "I'd appreciate the opportunity to become better acquainted with Silverbrook," Abigail agreed. "I noticed several supplies we might need." "We don't need anything," Elizabeth interjected quickly. "We have everything necessary." Abigail studied the girl's defensive posture, understanding that discussions of household needs touched on financial concerns Elizabeth considered her domain. "Nevertheless, I'd like to see what's available," she said neutrally. "One can always plan ahead." The walk to town took 20 minutes, following the same dirt road Abigail had traveled the previous day by wagon. The 3 school-aged girls led the way, with Mary skipping ahead periodically to investigate interesting rocks or plants before racing back to report her discoveries. Rose stayed close to Catherine, occasionally reaching for her elder sisters. And, when the path narrowed, Grace remained at the cabin with Elizabeth, who explained that the youngest wasn't yet required to attend school and often helped with household chores. The explanation sounded rehearsed, suggesting Grace's absence from school might have more to do with her selective mutism than any need for her assistance at home. Silverbrook looked different in the morning light. Miners headed toward the larger company dig sites on the northern slope, storekeepers swept wooden sidewalks, and wagons delivered goods to the mercantile. The town possessed a rugged energy, its inhabitants moving with purpose, despite the remote location. At the schoolhouse, a well-maintained building with a bell tower and freshly painted trim, Mrs. Coleman greeted them on the steps. Her sharp eyes took in Abigail's presence with undisguised surprise. "Miss Montgomery, I didn't expect to see you this morning." "I've agreed to a 2-week arrangement with Mr. Parker," Abigail explained, noting how the teacher's eyebrows rose at this information. "Indeed, how progressive of you both." Mrs. Coleman turned to the girls with a warmer expression. "Inside now, children. We're beginning geography lessons today." As Mary and Rose hurried in, Catherine lingered. "Miss Montgomery will be exploring town this morning," she explained. "Perhaps you could suggest points of interest." The request clearly amused Mrs. Coleman, though she masked it quickly. "Certainly. The mercantile has the widest selection of goods. Harrison's assay office maintains the postal services. The church doubles as our town meeting hall." She paused. "And you might find the Ladies' Aid Society gathering at Mrs. Wilson's home informative. They meet Tuesday mornings to discuss community improvements." "Today is Tuesday," Abigail noted. "So it is." Mrs. Coleman's expression suggested this was no coincidence. Sarah Parker was an active member before her passing. The ladies would be interested to meet her potential successor. The implication was clear. Abigail would be subjected to intense scrutiny by the town's female leadership. Rather than feeling intimidated, Abigail found herself intrigued by The opportunity to learn more about Silverbrook and the Parker family from different perspectives. Thank you for the suggestion. I'll certainly pay my respects. Catherine hurried into the schoolhouse as the bell rang, leaving Abigail and Mrs. Coleman alone on the steps. "I feel obligated to ask, Miss Montgomery," the teacher said in a lower voice. "Are you fully aware of what you're undertaking? Thomas Parker is a good man, but those children present unique challenges." "I'm beginning to understand the situation," Abigail replied, "though I suspect there's context beyond what I've observed so far." Mrs. Coleman's expression softened slightly. "Sarah was my dearest friend. When the influenza took her, it left wounds deeper than most realize. Thomas retreated into his work, Elizabeth into rigid responsibility. The younger ones each responded differently." She sighed. "Grace's silence concerns me most. She was only 2 when Sarah died, too young to process such loss through normal means." Did Thomas seek help for her? "The nearest doctor with any understanding of childhood afflictions is in Helena, 3 days' journey each way. Thomas tried once, but Grace became so distraught on the trail that he turned back." Mrs. Coleman adjusted her shawl. The previous candidates were unprepared for the complexity of the situation, and you believe I will be similarly overwhelmed. The teacher studied Abigail with new interest. "Most women who answer such advertisements seek security, not challenges. You strike me as different, Miss Montgomery. I've never been afraid of challenges, Mrs. Coleman, only of wasted potential." This response seemed to satisfy the teacher, who nodded thoughtfully. "The Wilson home is the blue clapboard at the end of Pine Street. Martha Wilson makes excellent currant scones." With that parting information, she turned and entered the schoolhouse, the door closing firmly behind her. Abigail spent the next hour exploring Silverbrook methodically. The Mercantile indeed offered an impressive selection for such a remote location, though prices reflected the difficulty of transportation. The proprietor, Mr. Wilson, greeted her with barely concealed curiosity, his questions about her visit to the Parker homestead transparent in their purpose. "The arrangement is temporary," Abigail explained, examining a bolt of sturdy cotton. 2 weeks to determine compatibility." "Sensible approach," Mr. Wilson allowed, measuring the fabric she'd selected. "The Parker girls are spirited but good-hearted. Elizabeth has account privileges here, though she's cautious with their credit, as any responsible household manager would be," Abigail replied, noting this confirmation of Elizabeth's financial authority. At precisely 10 o'clock, Abigail made her way to the blue clapboard house Mrs. Coleman had indicated. The sound of female voices emerged through open windows, along with the scent of fresh baking. She straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt, and knocked firmly on the door. The conversation inside immediately hushed. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal a plump, pleasant-faced woman in her 40s, her expression transforming from polite inquiry to undisguised interest as she registered Abigail's identity. "You must be Miss Montgomery. I'm Martha Wilson." She stepped back, gesturing Abigail inside. "Ladies, our special guest has arrived." The Wilson home's parlor contained 8 women of various ages, all seated in a semicircle of chairs and settees, their needlework temporarily forgotten as they assessed Abigail with undisguised curiosity. Martha Wilson performed hasty introductions that Abigail catalogued methodically. The minister's wife, the assayer's sister, the company doctor's mother, and several others whose connections to Silverbrook were equally established. "We were just discussing the school fundraising bazaar," Martha explained, ushering Abigail to a vacant chair prominently positioned to face the group. "But I'm certain everyone would much rather hear about your journey to Silverbrook and your impressions of our little community." The invitation was delivered with warm hospitality, but Abigail recognized an examination when she encountered one. These women formed the social backbone of Silverbrook, They would have known Sarah Parker well, would have watched the family's struggle after her passing, and would undoubtedly have opinions about any woman who might step into the role of Thomas. Parker's wife. My journey was uneventful, if dusty, Abigail replied, accepting a cup of tea from her hostess. As for impressions, I've hardly had time to form any definitive ones, having arrived only yesterday. And yet you've remained, when others departed immediately, observed an older woman introduced as Mrs. Hammond, the doctor's mother. The previous candidates found the situation overwhelming. I believe in thorough assessment before making decisions, Abigail said, meeting the woman's gaze directly. 2 weeks seems a reasonable period to determine compatibility. A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. 2 weeks? Repeated Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife. How modern. I prefer to think of it as practical, Abigail countered smoothly. Marriage is a significant commitment. Both parties deserve adequate information before proceeding. And the children? Mrs. Hammond inquired, her tone gentle but probing. How do you find them? Abigail considered her response carefully, aware that anything she said would certainly be discussed thoroughly after her departure. They are remarkably resilient, admirably loyal to each other, and clearly well loved by their father. Elizabeth manages the household with impressive capability, considering her youth. She's had to grow up too quickly, Martha Wilson sighed, passing a plate of scones. Sarah's death left a terrible void. Thomas means well, but a man can only do so much, especially with that mind consuming his attention, added Mrs. Peterson, with a hint of disapproval. The man works from dawn until well after dusk, most days. Is the silver claim substantial? Abigail asked, recognizing an opportunity to gather information about the family's financial situation. The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, Mrs. Hammond spoke. Thomas Parker's claim is among the more promising independent operations in the area. Not as large as the Granger Company mines, but consistent. If he could secure proper investment for equipment, improvements, it could be quite profitable. Investment requires connections, added the assayer's sister, Mrs. Blackburn, a sharp-featured woman who had been quietly observing until now. And connections require social participation, which Thomas has avoided since Sarah's passing. Abigail absorbed this information, understanding more about why Thomas had sought a wife through advertisement. He needed not just household help, but also someone who could navigate social waters he had abandoned, potentially securing the connections necessary for his mind's expansion. And little Grace, Martha Wilson said, lowering her voice slightly. Has she spoken yet in your presence? No, Abigail replied honestly, though we've only just met. Such a tragedy, Mrs. Peterson murmured. She was speaking in complete sentences before Sarah fell ill, remarkably verbal for her age. Then, after the funeral, not another word. Dr. Hammond believes it's a form of shock, his mother explained. The child retreated into herself when confronted with a loss she couldn't comprehend. Mrs. Winters tried bribing her with sweets, Martha recalled. Miss Hargrove attempted to force her to speak through withholding privileges. Neither approach proved effective, unsurprisingly. Abigail carefully controlled her expression, though internally she winced at such misguided methods. Children process grief differently than adults, she observed. Patience often accomplishes what pressure cannot. This comment seemed to meet with approval, particularly from Mrs. Hammond, who nodded thoughtfully. You sound experienced in such matters, Miss Montgomery. My mother died when I was 12, Abigail explained. My younger brother stopped speaking. For nearly 6 months afterward, my father consulted specialists who recommended gentle encouragement rather than force. This personal revelation shifted the atmosphere subtly. The women's expressions softened from assessment to tentative acceptance. Martha Wilson refreshed Abigail's tea with a warmer smile than before. "Thomas has tried everything within his power," Mrs. Peterson said, "but a man doesn't have the natural intuition for nurturing that a woman possesses. Those girls need a mother's touch." "They need consistency and security," Abigail corrected gently, "and respect for their existing family structure. No one can replace Sarah Parker, nor should anyone try." The ladies of Silverbrook seemed startled by this perspective, exchanging glances that suggested they found Abigail's viewpoint unexpected, but not necessarily disagreeable. "A pragmatic approach," Mrs. Hammond commented approvingly, "refreshing in its way." As the gathering continued, Abigail found herself fielding questions about her background, education, and family connections. She answered honestly but selectively, emphasizing her experience managing her father's household and business affairs while downplaying the reason she had responded to a mail-order bride advertisement, namely her increasing spinsterhood and reputation for being difficult among Pittsburgh's eligible bachelors. By the time she departed an hour later, Abigail had gained valuable insights into Silverbrook society and the Parker families standing within it. The community clearly cared about Thomas and his daughters, but their concern was tinged with judgment about his retreat from social obligations and his handling of Grace's condition. The ladies had also revealed, perhaps unintentionally, that the family's financial situation was stable but precarious, with the mine's potential constrained by limited investment. Outside, Abigail paused to orient herself, considering her next destination. The morning air had warmed considerably, the October sun bathing the main street in golden light. Miners changed shifts at the larger operations north of town, their voices and laughter carrying across the distance. "Miss Montgomery." The call came from a tall, broad-shouldered man hurrying down the street, his clothes marking him as one of the more prosperous merchants rather than a miner. He tipped his hat as he approached, his expression affable but assessing. "James Wilson," he introduced himself. "I own the Mercantile. My wife mentioned you'd be stopping by our home this morning." "Mr. Wilson," Abigail acknowledged. "Your wife was most hospitable." "Martha's always had a soft spot for the Parker family," he replied, "as have most of us in Silverbrook. Thomas is well respected despite his social reticence these past years." "So I gather." Wilson studied her with undisguised curiosity. "I understand you've agreed to a 2-week arrangement, most unusual but practical in its way." "News travels quickly in Silverbrook," Abigail observed dryly. The merchant chuckled. "That it does, though in this case Thomas himself mentioned it. When he came by for supplies this morning, he seemed cautiously optimistic." This information surprised Abigail, who had assumed Thomas would be as private about their arrangement as he was about most matters. "Mr. Parker is a difficult man to read." "He wasn't always so," Wilson replied, falling into step beside her as she continued down the street. Before Sarah's passing, Thomas was quite involved in community affairs, served on the town council, organized the Miners' Benevolent Fund, even played fiddle at social gatherings. Abigail tried to reconcile this description with the somber, taciturn man she had met. "Grief changes people," she said simply. "Indeed it does," Wilson agreed. "But life continues, particularly when there are children to consider." He paused. As they reached the corner, "I don't mean to presume, Miss Montgomery, but if you decide to remain in Silverbrook beyond your initial agreement, you should know that Thomas Parker is a better man than recent circumstances might suggest." Before Abigail could respond to this unexpected endorsement, Wilson tipped his hat again. "I should return to my business. Good day, Miss Montgomery." As he walked away, Abigail pondered this interaction. James Wilson had gone out of his way to speak with her. Not to satisfy curiosity, it seemed, but to provide context she might not otherwise receive. His assessment of Thomas Parker carried weight precisely because it wasn't delivered, as part of the women's collective evaluation, but as a personal observation from one who had known Thomas both before and after his loss. Continuing her exploration of Silverbrook, Abigail made note of both the town's resources and its limitations. The assay office doubled as a rudimentary bank, the church maintained a small lending library, and the doctor visited only twice monthly from Helena. Most notable was the complete absence of a school library or educational materials beyond basic primers, a deficiency that might explain Mrs. Coleman's evident frustration. By midday, Abigail had compiled a mental inventory of Silverbrook's assets and needs, with particular attention to resources that might benefit the Parker children. As she headed toward the schoolhouse to meet the girls for their walk home, her mind was already formulating plans for the coming days, practical initiatives that would demonstrate her value without overstepping the boundaries Elizabeth so fiercely guarded. The schoolhouse bell rang just as she arrived, and children spilled from the building with the universal energy of the recently liberated. Mary spotted her immediately, racing down the steps with characteristic enthusiasm. "Miss Montgomery!" "You came!" she exclaimed, as if Abigail's presence was an unexpected delight rather than their arranged meeting. "Did you see the whole town? Did you meet Mrs. Wilson? Did you try her currant scones? They're famous all the way to Helena." "Yes, to all three questions," Abigail replied, smiling despite herself at the girl's exuberance. "The scones lived up to their reputation." Catherine joined them more sedately, rose close behind. "How did you find the Ladies' Aid Society?" the middle girl asked, her perception impressive for her 12 years. "Informative," Abigail answered diplomatically. "They seem quite involved in community affairs." "They talk a lot," Mary confided, in a stage whisper, sometimes about people who aren't even there to defend themselves. "Mary," Catherine scolded, though her expression suggested she didn't entirely disagree. As they began the walk home, Abigail noticed a group of miners' children watching them with undisguised curiosity. One boy, perhaps 13, called out, "Hey, Mary, is that another new mother? How long's this one staying?" Mary's face flushed crimson, but before she could respond, Abigail stepped forward, her posture straight and her gaze direct. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she said to the boy, her voice calm but carrying. "I'm Miss Montgomery, a guest of the Parker family." The boy's bravado faltered under her steady regard. "Billy Jenkins, ma'am," he mumbled, suddenly finding his boots fascinating. "Well, Mr. Jenkins, in the future I suggest you direct any questions about me to me, rather than shouting them across a schoolyard. It's both impolite and inefficient." Several of the boy's companions snickered at his discomfort, but fell silent. When Abigail's gaze swept to include them, "That applies to all of you, naturally." Without waiting for a response, she turned back to the Parker girls. "Shall we continue?" As they walked away, Mary looked up at Abigail with something approaching. "Oh, nobody ever stands up to Billy Jenkins. His father supervises the Granger mine. His father's position doesn't entitle him to poor manners," Abigail replied evenly, "nor does it exempt him from the consequences of his choices." Catherine studied Abigail with newfound respect. "Most adults don't consider children's feelings worth defending. I disagree. Children's feelings are often more intense than adults, having not yet been tempered by experience." Abigail adjusted her pace to match Rose's shorter stride. "How was school today? Did you learn anything interesting?" The simple question, delivered with genuine interest, opened a floodgate. Mary launched into a detailed account of their geography, lesson on the Rocky Mountains, while Catherine described a science experiment involving magnets. Even Rose contributed quietly, explaining how Mrs. Coleman had praised her handwriting sample. By the time they reached the cabin, Abigail had gained a thorough understanding of Silverbrook School's curriculum, teacher dynamics, and social hierarchies, all from the perspective of children who observed far more than adults typically credited. Elizabeth was waiting at the door as they approached, her posture tense and her expression concerned. "You're late," she said, addressing her sisters rather than Abigail. "You should have been home 20 minutes ago." "We walked at Rose's pace," Abigail explained, noting how the youngest girl shrank slightly at being identified as the cause of delay. "And we stopped to admire a particularly impressive hawk circling above the eastern ridge." "It was enormous," Mary added enthusiastically. "Miss Montgomery said it might be a red-tailed hawk hunting for field mice." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Abigail, her disapproval evident. "There are chores waiting. The wash needs hanging, kindling needs splitting, and I've barely started dinner preparations." "Then it's fortunate you have additional help today," Abigail replied calmly. "Girls, change into your work clothes and meet me in the yard in 5 minutes. We'll divide the tasks to finish them more efficiently." The 3 younger girls hurried inside, but Elizabeth remained in the doorway, her stance protective of her domain. "We have a system that works. We don't need assistance," Abigail finished gently. "Everyone needs assistance occasionally, Elizabeth. Accepting help isn't weakness, it's practicality." The girl's chin lifted stubbornly. "We've managed for 2 years without interference." "Managed, yes, but at what cost to you?" Abigail's directness seemed to catch Elizabeth off guard. "You've shouldered responsibilities that would challenge women twice your age. There's no shame in sharing that burden." Before Elizabeth could respond, a small figure appeared beside her in the doorway. Grace, still clutching her wooden horse, regarded Abigail with solemn concentration. To everyone's surprise, the child extended her free hand toward Abigail in clear invitation. Elizabeth's expression shifted from defensive to astonished. "She wants to show you something," she translated, her voice hushed with disbelief. Abigail accepted the tiny hand without hesitation. "I would be honored to see whatever Grace wishes to share." The little girl led her past Elizabeth, through the cabin's main room, and toward the back door, which opened onto a small, sheltered garden area. Here, partially protected from Montana's harsh weather by the cabin's rear wall and a stand of pines, grew a variety of plants in neat rows and clusters. "This was Mother's garden," Elizabeth explained, following them outside. "Grace helps me tend it." Grace tugged Abigail toward a section where late-blooming Michaelmas daisies created a patch of purple against the autumn browns. With careful deliberation, the child selected a perfect bloom and offered it to Abigail. "Thank you, Grace," Abigail said, accepting the flower with appropriate solemnity. "It's beautiful." The interaction was brief, but significant. Grace had initiated contact, had chosen to share something precious, had communicated in her own way. Elizabeth watched with an expression Abigail couldn't quite decipher. Hope mingled with uncertainty, perhaps even a touch of fear. "She hasn't invited anyone to the garden since," Elizabeth trailed off, clearing her throat. "Not even Mrs. Coleman." "It's a special place," Abigail observed, careful not to overemphasize the breakthrough. "You've maintained it beautifully." Elizabeth's posture relaxed fractionally. "The soil's not ideal, but the southern exposure helps. We grow herbs for cooking and some medicinal plants. Mother started it the first summer they built the cabin." "The markers are very clear," Abigail noted, gesturing to the small wooden stakes labeled in neat handwriting. "Your work?" "Mother's originally. I copied her writing as exactly as I could when the old ones rotted." Elizabeth's voice carried a subtle pride beneath its practicality. The garden was important to her. She said, "Growing things reminds us that life continues even when we lose those we love." Abigail finished softly. Elizabeth nodded, momentarily unguarded. The garden was the last place Grace spoke. She told Mother the bees were dancing on the sunflowers. 2 days later, Mother was gone. The significance of Grace sharing this space suddenly took on new weight. Abigail looked down at the child, who had returned to examining the flowers with careful hands. "Thank you for showing me your special place, Grace," she said gently. "Perhaps tomorrow you can teach me the plants' names." For a fleeting moment, something flickered in the little girl's eyes. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a hint of connection. Then she returned to her silent contemplation of the garden, the wooden horse still clutched in one hand. The moment of vulnerability passed as quickly as it had appeared. Elizabeth straightened her shoulders, the practical household manager once more. "We should join the others. Those chores won't complete themselves." The remainder of the afternoon unfolded in a flurry of domestic activity. Abigail organized the girls into efficient teams, pairing Mary with Catherine to hang laundry while she helped Rose sort kindling by size. Elizabeth, though initially resistant to interference in her domain, gradually accepted Abigail's assistance with dinner preparations. "You're quite skilled with a knife," Elizabeth observed, as Abigail deftly chopped vegetables for a stew. "Most ladies from the East have servants for such tasks." "My father believed in practical education," Abigail replied, scraping the cut carrots into the pot. "He insisted I learn every aspect of household management, from budgeting to food preservation." Was he preparing you to be a mail-order bride? The question held a hint of challenge. "He was preparing me to be self-sufficient," Abigail corrected, mildly, though I doubt he envisioned this particular application of those skills. Elizabeth added salt to the pot with practiced precision. "Why did you answer father's advertisement? You're educated, capable. Surely you had other options in Pittsburgh." The directness of the question deserved equal honesty. "My prospects in Pittsburgh were limited by my reputation for being outspoken and independent-minded, qualities not universally admired in potential wives." "So you came west where standards are lower?" Elizabeth's tone sharpened. "I came west where different qualities might be valued," Abigail countered. "Frontier life demands practicality over propriety, resilience over refinement. My father's failing. Health meant our household would soon pass to my cousin's control. I preferred to determine my own future rather than become a dependent relation." Elizabeth absorbed this explanation, her expression thoughtful. "At least you're honest about your motivations, as I expect others to be with me," Abigail replied, the reference to Thomas's omission not lost on the girl. Their conversation was interrupted by Grace tugging at Elizabeth's apron, pointing urgently toward the window. In the distance, two figures approached on horseback, Thomas Parker and another man, both riding at a pace suggesting urgency rather than leisure. "That's Dr. Hammond." Elizabeth identified the second rider, setting aside her wooden spoon immediately. "He only comes when summoned." The girls gathered at the window, their expressions revealing their collective anxiety about unexpected medical visits. Abigail recalled Mrs. Hammond mentioning her son's bi-monthly circuit from Helena. This unscheduled appearance suggested an emergency of some kind. Thomas and the doctor dismounted in the yard, their conversation too distant to overhear, but their grave expressions visible through the window. When they entered the cabin, Thomas's clothes bore fresh rock dust and a concerning rust-colored stain across one sleeve. "Girls, give us the room," he instructed, his tone leaving no space for argument. "Miss Montgomery, your assistance, please." Elizabeth hesitated, clearly torn between obedience and her perceived responsibility. "Is someone hurt? The Jenkins boys?" "Elizabeth," Thomas said more gently, "please take your sisters upstairs for now. I'll explain everything later." As the girls reluctantly retreated to the loft, Thomas turned to Abigail. "Jenkins's youngest boy was caught in a minor collapse this afternoon. His arm's broken, and he has some cuts that need stitching. His mother's delivering their new baby, so he's asked to bring the boy here until Jenkins can collect him." "Of course," Abigail agreed immediately, already moving to clear the kitchen table. "What do you need me to do?" Dr. Hammond, a trim man, in his 40s with intelligent eyes and a neat moustache, nodded approvingly at her practical response. "Boiled water, clean linens, and perhaps some of that stew I smell cooking. The boy's more frightened than seriously injured, but he'll need comfort as well as medical attention." Thomas disappeared outside, returning moments later supporting a boy of about 10, his face streaked with dirt and tears, his right arm cradled awkwardly against his chest. Billy Jenkins followed, helping his younger brother negotiate the doorway, his earlier bravado replaced by evident concern. "Easy now, Jacob," Dr. Hammond directed, as they settled the injured boy on the table Abigail had quickly covered with clean cloths. "Miss Montgomery is going to help me make you more comfortable while your father finishes securing the tunnel." Abigail worked efficiently alongside the doctor, providing supplies as needed and speaking softly to the frightened child as Hammond set and splinted his broken arm. The boy's injuries were painful but not life-threatening. A clean break to the forearm, several lacerations requiring stitches, and considerable bruising across his shoulder and back. Throughout the treatment, Billy Jenkins hovered nearby, his expression cycling between worry for his brother and wary glances toward Abigail. When Jacob whimpered during the stitching, Billy stepped forward instinctively, offering his hand for his brother to squeeze. "You're doing fine, Jakey," the older boy encouraged, his voice gruff with forced confidence. "Pa says Jenkins men don't cry over a little scratch." "It's acceptable to acknowledge pain," Abigail said quietly, holding a cloth to the boy's forehead. "Brave men feel fear and pain. They simply continue despite it." Billy looked startled by this perspective, but didn't argue. As Dr. Hammond finished the final stitches, Abigail brought a cup of broth from the simmering stew, helping Jacob sip it slowly. "The boys can stay here until Jenkins arrives," Thomas told the doctor as they washed their hands in the basin. "Might be several hours, given the work required to secure that section." "I've left laudanum for the pain," Hammond replied. "One drop in water if the discomfort becomes severe, though I expect he'll sleep naturally once the excitement wanes." The doctor prepared to depart, he paused beside Abigail. "You have a steady hand in a crisis, Miss Montgomery. Not everyone remains calm when faced with blood and distress. My father's manufacturing business saw its share of accidents," she explained. "I learned early that hysteria helps no one." Hammond nodded approvingly. "Silverbrook could use more practical thinking like yours." With a pointed glance toward Thomas, he added, "I hope we'll have the opportunity to benefit from it long term." After the doctor's departure, Thomas called the girls down from the loft. They entered cautiously, their expressions shifting from concern to curiosity at the sight of the Jenkins brothers in their kitchen. Elizabeth immediately took charge of serving dinner, setting aside her earlier friction with Abigail in the face of the emergency. "Billy can sit by me," Mary offered eagerly, clearly delighted by the unexpected dinner guests. "Jacob needs to rest," Abigail said, helping the younger boy to the cushioned rocking chair near the fire. "Perhaps you could keep him company while the rest of us eat, Mary? Tell him about that hawk we saw today." The evening unfolded in unexpected harmony, the ordinary tensions suspended by the shared purpose of caring for the injured child. Even Elizabeth worked alongside Abigail without her usual guardedness, efficiently managing the expanded dinner service, while Catherine prepared a pallet for Jacob near the fireplace. As dusk settled over the cabin, Abigail observed Thomas's interaction with the Jenkins boys, his quiet competence in checking Jacob's splint, his matter-of-fact assurances that their father would arrive soon, his lack of condescension when addressing Billy's concerns about the mine's safety. Without fanfare or demonstration, he exhibited the steady confidence of a man accustomed to handling crises. When Jacob finally dozed off, exhausted from pain and excitement, Billy sat awkwardly at the kitchen table, caught between childhood and the premature responsibility thrust upon him by frontier life. Thomas handed him a cup of coffee, treating him with the respect due a fellow worker rather than a schoolboy. "Your quick action likely saved your brother from more serious injury," Thomas told him. "That was good thinking, using your shirt as a tourniquet." Billy's chest swelled slightly at the praise. "Pa taught me what to do if anyone got caught. Said every miner needs to know basic doctoring. Your father's a wise man." Thomas glanced toward the window, where darkness had fully descended. "He'll be along soon, once they've shored up that section properly." As the conversation continued, Abigail helped Elizabeth prepare for the night, setting out extra blankets and ensuring water was available should Jacob wake thirsty. The girls, reluctant to miss any excitement, were finally persuaded to prepare for bed themselves. "Billy Jenkins was nicer tonight," Rose observed as Abigail helped her wash her face at the basin. "He's usually mean at school." "People often show different sides of themselves in different circumstances," Abigail replied, handing her a towel. "Sometimes what looks like meanness is actually fear or uncertainty." Rose considered this with serious contemplation. "Like how Elizabeth acts stern when she's really worried." Abigail hid her smile at the child's perceptiveness. Exactly like that. From across the room, Elizabeth pretended not to hear, though a faint flush colored her cheeks as she turned down the lamps. Whatever retort she might have delivered was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jenkins had arrived to collect his sons. Frank Jenkins looked nothing like Abigail had imagined. Rather than the gruff, hardened foreman described in town gossip, the man who entered the Parker cabin was soft-spoken and visibly exhausted, his weathered face etched with lines of worry that momentarily eased at the sight of his sons, safe inside. "Thomas," he acknowledged with a nod before his attention fixed entirely on Jacob. "How bad?" "Clean break and some stitches," Thomas replied. "Hammond says he'll heal fully with proper rest." Jenkins knelt beside his sleeping son, gently examining the splint and bandages with the careful touch of a man accustomed to handling precious things despite calloused hands. "You did this?" he asked, glancing up at Thomas. "Miss Montgomery assisted Dr. Hammond," Thomas corrected, nodding toward Abigail. "She kept Jacob calm during the setting." Jenkins turned to regard her properly, surprise evident in his expression. "Miss Montgomery, the mail order—" He stopped himself, glancing at Billy, who was listening intently. "I'm grateful for your help, Ma'am." "Anyone would have done the same," Abigail replied simply. "Not anyone," Jenkins contradicted quietly. "The last lady who stayed with the Parkers fainted at the sight of a cut finger." He carefully gathered his sleeping son into his arms. "Billy thanked Mr. and Miss Parker properly for their hospitality." Billy shuffled his feet, his earlier bravado completely absent. "Thank you, sir." His eyes flicked briefly to Abigail. "And I apologize for my behavior at the schoolyard today, Miss Montgomery. It was improper." Abigail acknowledged his apology with a dignified nod. "Apology accepted, Mr. Jenkins. I trust tomorrow will mark a fresh beginning." Something in her measured response, neither condescending nor overly familiar, seemed to resonate with the boy. He straightened slightly, nodding with newfound seriousness before following his father outside to the waiting wagon. Thomas closed the door behind them, turning to find Elizabeth already organizing the cleanup with her usual efficiency. The evenings. Emergency had disrupted dinner and bedtime routines, but the Parker household was quickly re-establishing its rhythms. "That was well handled," Thomas said quietly to Abigail as they stood slightly apart from the bustling activity. "Both the medical situation and young Billy. You sound surprised." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth beneath his beard. "I am recalibrating my expectations, Miss Montgomery. My previous experience with potential companions did not include medical emergencies or corrections of town bullies. Perhaps your advertisement should have mentioned such possibilities," Abigail suggested, a hint of dry humor in her tone. "Along with 5 daughters and a struggling mine." His expression sobered. I imagine your first day in Silverbrook has provided more information than any advertisement could contain. Abigail considered this. The Ladies' Aid Society was particularly informative. Thomas winced. I can imagine. Martha Wilson means well, but discretion isn't her strongest quality. Actually, I found their perspectives valuable, if somewhat filtered. Through their own preconceptions, Abigail glanced toward the girls, ensuring they were out of earshot. They spoke highly of Sarah, and of you before your withdrawal from community affairs. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah was the social heart of our family. I lacked both her skill and her inclination for such matters. Yet you recognize their importance for the mind's development. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've been thorough in your investigations. I believe in making informed decisions. Abigail met his gaze directly. If I'm to consider a permanent position here, I need to understand all aspects of the situation, financial as well as familial. For a moment, Thomas seemed caught between offense at her forthrightness and respect for her practical approach. Finally, he nodded. Tomorrow evening, after the girls are asleep, I'll show you the mine accounts. You should know exactly what you'd be committing to or walking away from. This concession, delivered without defensiveness, marked a subtle shift in their dynamic. Thomas was acknowledging her as a potential partner, rather than merely a caretaker for his children, someone whose judgment and discretion he might trust with matters beyond the domestic sphere. The next morning brought new routines as Abigail integrated herself into the Parker household's rhythms. She rose early to help Elizabeth with breakfast preparations, careful to support rather than supplant the girl's established authority. When Thomas emerged from his bedroom, he found the kitchen running with surprising harmony, his daughters engaged in their morning chores without the usual friction. I'll be testing the new supports today, he announced, as he accepted a cup of coffee from Elizabeth. Jenkins is bringing the structural timber we discussed. Will it be dangerous? Catherine asked, concern evident in her voice. All mining carries risk, Thomas replied, his standard response to such questions. But we take precautions. Abigail noticed how this answer did little to ease Catherine's worry, though the girl didn't press further. The exchange revealed much about the family's communication patterns. Thomas's tendency towards stoic reassurance rather than detailed explanation, the girls' learned habit of containing their fears rather than burdening their father. Perhaps Mr. Parker could explain the support system to us this evening, Abigail suggested, setting plates on the table. I'd be interested to understand how the reinforcement works. Thomas looked surprised by this request. It's rather technical. Nevertheless, it might be educational for all of us, Abigail persisted gently. Catherine shows aptitude for structural concepts in her schoolwork, according to Mrs. Coleman, and understanding often diminishes unnecessary worry. Thomas considered this approach, visibly reassessing his assumptions about both Abigail and his daughters. Very well, we can review the mind diagrams after dinner. Catherine's expression brightened noticeably at being acknowledged as capable of understanding such technical matters. Even Elizabeth seemed intrigued by this departure from their father's usual reticence about mining operations. The morning progressed with increasing comfort as Abigail established her place within the household. She accompanied the school-aged girls to Silverbrook, using the walk to learn more about their individual interests and concerns. Mary chattered about her fascination with geography and distant places she hoped to visit someday. Catherine revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of botany, describing her experiments with plant propagation behind the schoolhouse. Rose remained quiet until Abigail specifically asked about her favorite subjects. Drawing, the 7-year-old admitted shyly. Mrs. Coleman lets me use colored chalk sometimes when I finish my other work. Perhaps we could look for drawing materials at Mr. Wilson's store, Abigail suggested. Every artist needs proper tools. Rose's eyes widened at being called an artist. Really? But Elizabeth says we can't spend money on things that aren't necessary. Some necessities aren't physical, Abigail replied thoughtfully. The mind and spirit need nourishment as well as the body. At the schoolhouse, Mrs. Coleman greeted them with evident surprise at Abigail's continued presence. "Day 2, she observed, her tone suggesting she'd expected Abigail to have departed on the morning stage. "How are you finding life in the Parker household, Miss Montgomery?" "Educational," Abigail replied with a small smile. "And surprisingly eventful. Yes, I heard about young Jacob Jenkins' accident. The mine claims another victim, though thankfully not a fatal one this time." The teacher's expression conveyed her opinion of mining dangers quite clearly. Jenkins's shaft wasn't properly supported. Mary offered importantly. "Father says the company mines cut corners on timber to save costs." Mrs. Coleman cast a sharp glance at the girl. "That's not a topic for children to discuss, Mary." "Why not?" Abigail asked mildly. "The realities of mining affect these children's lives directly. Pretending dangers don't exist doesn't protect them from consequences." The teacher studied Abigail with renewed interest. "You have unconventional views on children's education, Miss Montgomery." "I believe knowledge appropriately presented builds resilience rather than fear," Abigail clarified. "These girls are remarkably capable when treated as thinking individuals rather than delicate decorations." A slow smile spread across Mrs. Coleman's face. "I've been saying exactly that for years, to deaf ears mostly. Perhaps you'll prove a valuable addition to our community after all." This endorsement, though qualified, represented significant progress. As Abigail left the girls in Mrs. Coleman's capable hands, she felt a growing conviction that Silverbrook held greater potential than she'd initially assessed. Not just as a place of last resort for a stubborn spinster, but as a community where her particular strengths might be genuinely valued. Returning to the Parker cabin, Abigail found Elizabeth and Grace engaged in laundry preparations, heating water in large cauldrons over the outdoor fire pit. The October morning had warmed enough to make outdoor work pleasant, though the distant mountains wore fresh snow caps that hinted at winter's approach. "You returned," Elizabeth observed, stirring the water with a wooden paddle. "I half expected you to take the eastbound stage after encountering the Ladies' Aid Society." "They were quite welcoming, actually," Abigail replied, rolling up her sleeves to help, "though their curiosity was barely contained. They've been speculating about Father's mail-order brides for months." Elizabeth tested the water temperature with practiced judgment. "Mrs. Wilson has a betting book on how long each candidate will last." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. And what odds am I given?" A reluctant smile tugged at Elizabeth's mouth. 3 days, according to Mary, who overheard Mr. Wilson discussing it at the Mercantile. "Apparently your forthright manner makes you an unlikely match for frontier life." "How interesting," Abigail mused, lifting the heavy soap paddle. "I've always found forthrightness particularly suited to challenging circumstances. Artifice requires too much energy to maintain when there's real work to be done." Elizabeth's assessment of Abigail seemed to shift subtly with this statement. "That's sensible, actually." "High praise indeed," Abigail teased gently, earning another almost smile from the girl. They worked together efficiently, establishing a rhythm that accommodated Grace's smaller contributions. The child seemed content to sort clothing into piles, occasionally bringing items to Abigail for inspection, as if testing whether this new presence would acknowledge her silent communication. "She's helping more than usual," Elizabeth noted quietly as Grace carefully arranged socks in pairs. "Normally, laundry day makes her retreat to the garden." Perhaps she finds certainty in organizing things, Abigail suggested. Order within chaos provides comfort. Elizabeth considered this perspective, watching her youngest sister with newfound understanding. Mother always said Grace had an old soul in a young body. She notices things others miss. As if aware she was being discussed, Grace looked up, her solemn blue eyes moving between Elizabeth and Abigail. Then, with deliberate care, she selected a small blue ribbon from her pocket and placed it on the sorting table before returning to her task. "That's her favorite hair ribbon," Elizabeth explained, surprise evident in her voice, "the only one she never loses or gives away." The significance of this gesture wasn't lost on Abigail, though she was careful not to overreact. "Thank you, Grace," she said simply. "I'll keep it safe for you." The morning continued in this unexpectedly harmonious fashion, with Elizabeth gradually relaxing her vigilant control as Abigail demonstrated competence without threatening the girl's authority. By noon, they had completed the washing and hanging. The clothesline behind the cabin festooned with clean garments drying in the autumn sun. "We're more efficient together," Abigail observed as they carried the empty baskets inside. The work was completed in half the usual time. Elizabeth nodded, a hint of reluctant admiration in her expression. "You work harder than the previous—" "Ladies, Mrs. Winters complained that laundry would ruin her complexion." Miss Hargrove refused outright, claiming it wasn't a proper task for an educated woman. "Education and practical skills aren't mutually exclusive," Abigail replied, setting water to boil for tea. "My father believed women should be prepared for any circumstance." "Your father sounds unusually progressive. He was practical. After my mother died, he recognized that traditional feminine accomplishments provided limited security in a changing world." Abigail arranged cups on the table as she spoke. "He insisted I learn bookkeeping alongside embroidery, home medicine, alongside piano." Elizabeth considered this while slicing bread for their midday meal. "Our mother taught us similar values, though she emphasized different skills. She believed in self-sufficiency, but also in community interdependence." A wise perspective. No family truly exists in isolation, particularly in places like Silverbrook. This observation seemed to strike a chord with Elizabeth, who glanced toward the window where distant figures moved around the mine entrance. "Father has tried to keep us separate since Mother died. He thinks it protects us from further hurt." "And does it?" Abigail asked gently. Elizabeth's hands stilled, her expression momentarily unguarded. "No," she admitted quietly. "It just makes the hurt more lonely." The 2 weeks Abigail had negotiated passed with surprising swiftness. Each day brought new understanding of the Parker family dynamics, the challenges they faced, and the potential for healing that existed beneath their protective shells. Thomas gradually revealed more about the mine's operations, sharing the account books as promised, and discussing his plans for expansion if proper investment could be secured. "The silver vein runs deeper than most independent claims," he explained. One evening, as they reviewed diagrams spread across the kitchen table after the girls had gone to bed. "With proper equipment, we could double production within 6 months. But acquiring that equipment requires capital you don't currently have," Abigail observed, studying the financial records with a practiced eye. Her father's manufacturing business had given her considerable experience with such matters. "Exactly." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Abigail had come to recognize as signaling frustration. "The Granger Company offers to buy me out regularly, but at a fraction of the claim's true value." "What about a partnership with other independent miners?" Abigail suggested. "Pooling resources for equipment that benefits multiple operations." Thomas looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "That's actually a sound approach. Jenkins and I discussed something similar last year, but it lost momentum when When you withdrew from community engagement, Abigail finished gently. He nodded, acknowledging the truth without defensiveness. Sarah handled the social aspects of business. I focused on technical operations. Without her, you lost more than a wife, Abigail observed. You lost a business partner. The simple recognition of this often overlooked aspect of his loss seemed to affect Thomas deeply. For a moment, his carefully maintained composure faltered, revealing the grief he typically kept hidden from his daughters. Yes, he said simply. She understood people in ways I never will. This conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Thomas began consulting Abigail about business matters more frequently, valuing her analytical approach and financial acumen. Together, they developed a proposal for a cooperative, equipment-sharing arrangement among Silverbrook's independent miners, a practical compromise between maintaining autonomy and achieving the economies of scale that larger operations enjoyed. With the girls, Abigail established different but equally meaningful connections. Mary thrived under her encouragement, devouring the books Abigail ordered from Helena's larger bookstore. Catherine blossomed when Abigail helped her establish a winter herb garden in the kitchen window, combining practical botany with the girls' natural scientific curiosity. Rose gradually emerged from her shyness, proudly displaying drawings created with the quality chalks Abigail had purchased from Wilson's store. Even Elizabeth's rigid defensiveness softened as she recognized Abigail, had no intention of usurping her position or erasing Sarah's memory. Instead, Abigail consistently acknowledged the girl's capabilities, while gently suggesting ways to share responsibilities that would allow Elizabeth to reclaim some aspects of normal adolescence. Most remarkable was Grace's transformation. Though she remained silent, her communication expanded through gestures, drawings, and increasing physical proximity to Abigail. The wooden horse became a means of expression, its positions and movements forming a language that Abigail learned to interpret with growing accuracy. On the morning marking the end of their agreed 2-week trial, Abigail woke before dawn. She, dressed with particular care, selecting her best day dress, a steel-gray wool that complemented her eyes. Today she would either commit to becoming part of the Parker family or return east on the afternoon stage. Either decision would irrevocably alter several lives, including her own. Thomas was already at the kitchen table when she emerged from her room. Account books opened before him, but his attention focused on the window where first light touched the Eastern Ridge. "You're up early," she observed, moving to stoke the fire. "I didn't sleep," he admitted without turning. Too many thoughts circling. Abigail nodded, understanding completely. "The 2 weeks ends today." Yes. He finally looked at her, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes revealed the strain of uncertainty. "Have you reached a decision?" "I have preliminary thoughts," Abigail replied, measuring coffee into the percolator with practiced movements. "But I believe this should be a mutual decision, not a unilateral one." Thomas studied her for a moment. "You're concerned I might have reservations?" "I think both parties should enter any partnership with clear understanding and genuine commitment," she clarified. "My question isn't whether you want me to stay, but whether you understand what that truly means." His eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm not sure I follow." Abigail sat across from him, her posture straight and her gaze direct. "If I remain in Silverbrook, it would not be as a traditional wife who confines herself to household matters and defers to her husband in all things. My nature doesn't allow for that, nor would it best serve this family's needs." Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. "What role do you envision, then?" "A true partnership," Abigail answered simply. "I would contribute to both domestic matters and business affairs. I would help raise your daughters with respect for their mother's memory, While encouraging their individual strengths, I would expect my perspective to be valued, my judgment trusted, and my independence respected. You're proposing quite a modern arrangement, Thomas observed, though his tone held curiosity rather than dismissal. I'm proposing a practical one, Abigail corrected. This family needs more than a stepmother and housekeeper. The mine needs more than occasional bookkeeping. And I need more than the limited role traditionally assigned to women. Thomas was silent for a long moment, his weathered hands resting on the account books that represented both his livelihood and his constant worry. Finally, he looked up, his expression more open than Abigail had yet witnessed. When I placed that advertisement, he began slowly, I thought I knew exactly what I needed. Someone to manage the household, help with correspondence, provide. A feminine influence for the girls. Someone convenient. Abigail nodded, appreciating his honesty. What I've discovered, he continued, is that what this family truly needs isn't what I initially sought. Elizabeth needs someone who respects her capabilities while allowing her to be young again. Catherine needs intellectual stimulation alongside practical skills. Mary needs direction for her boundless energy. Rose needs gentle encouragement to find her voice. He paused. And Grace needs whatever magic you've worked that has her communicating. More in 2 weeks than in 2 years. Not magic, Abigail demurred. Simply patience and observation. As for the mine, Thomas went on, your cooperative equipment proposal shows more business acumen than I've encountered in most men on the frontier. Jenkins and Wilson are already expressing interest. He straightened in his chair, his decision apparently reached. I find your terms not just acceptable, but preferable, Miss Montgomery. A true partnership would benefit this family far more than a traditional arrangement. Before Abigail could respond, a small noise from the stairway caught their attention. Grace stood on the bottom step, her wooden horse in one hand and a crumpled paper in the other. With deliberate steps, she crossed to the table and placed the paper before Abigail, watching expectantly as she unfolded it. The child's drawing showed 7 figures standing before a cabin. Thomas, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary, Rose, Grace, herself, and a tall figure with neatly pinned hair that could only be Abigail. Beneath the drawing, in the careful printing of a child just learning letters, were the words, "Stay, please." Abigail looked up, her carefully maintained composure momentarily shaken by this unexpected plea. But Grace wasn't finished. The little girl looked directly at Abigail, took a deep breath, and spoke her first words in over 2 years. "We need you." The simple phrase, delivered in a voice rusty from disuse, brought immediate tears to Thomas's eyes. He reached for his youngest daughter, gathering her into his arms with a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude. "Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You spoke." The child nodded solemnly, her attention still fixed on Abigail. "Will you stay?" she asked, the words forming slowly but distinctly. Elizabeth appeared at the foot of the stairs, her expression revealing she had witnessed her sister's breakthrough. Behind her, the other girls gathered, their faces reflecting hope and uncertainty in equal measure. The moment crystallized all that had developed over the past 2 weeks. Not just Grace's tentative emergence from silence, but the gradual healing of a family fractured by loss. Abigail had come to Silverbrook seeking security and purpose. What she had found instead was a place where her particular strengths were not just accepted but needed, where her forthright nature could forge connections, rather than create distance. "Yes, Grace," Abigail answered, her own voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "I will stay." The simple declaration set events in motion with surprising swiftness. Reverend Peterson performed a small ceremony in the church 2 days later, attended by the Ladies' Aid Society, The Jenkins family, Mrs. Coleman, and several miners who had signed onto the cooperative equipment arrangement. Martha Wilson provided a wedding cake that Mary declared almost as magnificent as Miss Montgomery herself, while Dr. Hammond offered a toast to Silverbrook's most uncommon mail-order bride and her extraordinary good sense. The ceremony was brief and unsentimental, reflecting both Thomas's practical nature and Abigail's preference for straightforward proceedings. Yet when they exchanged vows, the simple words carried weight beyond their traditional meaning, a genuine commitment to partnership rather than mere matrimony. As winter settled over Silverbrook, bringing deep snow and longer evenings, the Parker household established new rhythms and traditions. Abigail introduced read-aloud hours after dinner, expanded the girls' education beyond school curriculum, and established a weekly women's council where Elizabeth and Catherine could participate in household decisions as valued contributors, rather than merely executors of adult directives. Thomas, freed from the constant worry of managing both mine and home without adequate support, rediscovered his passion for innovation. The cooperative equipment arrangement brought new prosperity to Silverbrook's independent miners, establishing an alternative to the Granger Company's monopolistic practices. Most miraculous was Grace's transformation. Though still selective in her speech, preferring to communicate through drawing and gesture when possible, she spoke more frequently with each passing week. Her first complete sentence to someone outside the family came at Christmas dinner when she solemnly informed Mrs. Coleman that Mama Abigail says learning happens in many ways, not just with words. The term Mama Abigail had evolved naturally, without pressure or expectation. It acknowledged her role while preserving Sarah's memory as mother, a distinction that honored both women's contributions to the family. On a crisp February evening, as snow fell softly outside the cabin windows, Abigail sat at Sarah's old writing desk, now relocated to a corner of the main room. She was composing a letter to her father, updating him on the mine's progress and the girls' winter activities, when Thomas joined her, placing a small wooden box beside her paper. "What's this?" she asked, setting down her pen. "Open it," he suggested, his expression containing a hint of the boyish enthusiasm that occasionally emerged now that constant worry no longer dominated his demeanor. Inside the box lay a silver brooch in the shape of a mountain range, the metal gleaming with the distinctive luster of newly processed ore, the first silver from the new tunnel, Thomas explained. "I asked Wilson to commission it from the Helena silversmith. It seemed fitting that you should have the first fruits of our partnership." Abigail lifted the brooch, admiring its craftsmanship and the symbolism it represented. "It's beautiful," she said simply, pinning it to her collar. "Not traditional jewelry, perhaps," Thomas acknowledged. "But then we've established that tradition isn't always the best measure of value." Abigail smiled at this reference to their unconventional arrangement. "Speaking of non-traditional approaches, Elizabeth has developed an impressive talent for draft correspondence. She composed nearly all of this month's business letters." "I noticed," Thomas replied with evident pride. "Catherine has been asking to visit the assayer's office to learn more about mineral testing. She has a scientific mind." "Like her father," Abigail observed, "and a determination to question established methods, like her stepmother." He sat beside her, his expression growing more serious. "I realize I've never properly thanked you." "For what, specifically?" "For seeing what we needed, rather than what we thought we wanted." Thomas glanced toward the loft where the girls slept peacefully. "When Sarah died, I thought our family's best days were behind us. The best I hoped for was adequate management of what remained." Abigail waited, allowing him to find the words that didn't come easily to his practical nature. "What I didn't understand," he continued finally, "was that healing doesn't mean returning to what was lost. It means building something new that honors the past while embracing the future." He met her gaze directly. "You taught us that." Outside, the Montana winter wrapped Silverbrook in pristine white, the mining town quiet under its blanket of snow. Come spring, the cooperative's new equipment would transform the hillside operations, bringing prosperity to families who had struggled for generations against corporate interests and unforgiving terrain. But the most significant transformation had already occurred within the walls of the Parker home, where a woman once deemed too strong-willed had found precisely the family who needed her strength, her perspective, and her unwavering belief that conventional limitations were merely suggestions to be reconsidered in light of greater needs. Answering Thomas Parker's advertisement, Abigail Montgomery had sought security in a world that offered few options to women of independent mind. What she discovered instead was that the very qualities that had limited her prospects in Eastern society, her forthright nature, her analytical mind, her refusal to conform to restrictive expectations, were exactly what allowed her to forge authentic connections on the frontier. As she completed her letter home, Abigail reflected that the greatest journeys often lead to unexpected destinations. She had traveled west as a mail-order bride, only to become something far more valuable, a partner, a healer of wounded spirits, and the catalyst for a family's renewal. The path had not been easy, but like the silver veins hidden deep in Silverbrook's mountains, the most precious discoveries often required courage, perseverance, and the willingness to venture beyond established boundaries. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.